The first evening on that porch, I lasted maybe 6 minutes before I stood back up. Susan asked me where I was going, and I told her the truth, which was that I didn't actually know. I just knew I couldn't sit still another second, my legs already half out the screen door, before the rest of me had consciously decided to move at all. 30 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler does something specific to a man's nervous system, and nobody tells you, when you're finally parked for good, that the stillness itself becomes the hardest part of the entire transition. I want to walk you through how a man who spent 3 decades in constant motion learned to actually sit down and watch a sunset without his legs itching to move every single time. If you're new to this channel, subscribe, because I tell the real, occasionally restless version of these stories every week. My name is Gary Collins. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 30 years as an owner-operator, hauling refrigerated freight, mostly produce, out of a base in Amarillo, Texas, running routes that took me from California's Central Valley to distribution centers as far east as Georgia and as far north as Minnesota. I bought my first truck at 38, after 8 years driving for a company that owned the rig, and spent the next 30 years as my own boss, which in the trucking world mostly just means you're the one who decides which particular stretch of interstate you're going to be exhausted on that week. A joke I made often enough over the decades that Susan could probably recite it alongside me by now. My wife, Susan, worked as a labor and delivery nurse back in Amarillo for 34 years, a job with its own brutal, unpredictable hours. And between her rotating shifts and my routes, we built a 40-year marriage largely conducted over the phone, brief calls from truck stops, longer ones on my mandatory rest breaks, entire relationships with our 2 kids that ran through weekend visits home, and phone calls from the road more often than actual dinner tables. Our daughter Michelle once told me at her own wedding, half joking and half not, that she'd learned to recognize my truck's specific engine sound from 2 streets away before she'd learned to ride a bike, a comment that got a laugh from the room and stayed with me privately for years afterward as something closer to an indictment than a joke. Our son Kevin followed me into trucking himself for a few years in his 20s before switching to a regional route that let him sleep in his own bed most nights. A choice I understood completely, even though I never fully told him how much I respected it. I want to be honest about what 30 years of that specific rhythm does to a person, because I don't think enough people talk about it plainly. You stop being able to sit still, genuinely, physically. Your body learns that motion is the default state and stillness is the temporary interruption, the exact opposite of how most people experience their lives. And after 3 decades, that wiring doesn't just switch off the day you park the truck for the last time. Even sleep itself changed shape for me over those years. A light, easily interrupted rest built around mandated breaks rather than a genuine full night, and I didn't fully appreciate how deeply that pattern had rewired me until I found myself in a quiet Mexican house with nowhere to be and nothing to drive, still waking at odd hours out of pure habit, ready for a shift that no longer existed. I retired at 66, 2 years earlier than I'd originally planned, after a physical flagged my blood pressure high enough that my doctor, a straightforward man I'd been seeing for over a decade, told me flatly that continuing to drive 11-hour days at my age was a genuine cardiac risk I didn't need to be taking. I remember sitting in his office genuinely stunned, not by the diagnosis itself. I'd half expected something like it for years given the diet and sleep schedule the job demanded, but by how quickly an entire identity I'd spent 30 years building could be ended by a single number on a blood pressure cuff. I drove one final load, a produce run from Fresno to a distribution center outside Dallas, deliberately choosing a route I'd run probably 200 times over the decades. And I'll admit I cried somewhere around Flagstaff alone in the cab, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to since my own father's funeral 15 years earlier. I sold the truck within 3 months. The hardest sale of my life. Harder, honestly, than selling the house we eventually left behind, too. Watching a younger owner-operator drive it off my lot, with the specific mixture of pride and grief you'd feel handing off a genuinely good horse to someone who'd take proper care of it. Susan and I had talked about retiring somewhere warm for years, mostly in the abstract way couples talk about things decades out, and Mexico came up specifically because of a handful of runs I'd made decades earlier, hauling produce across the border into Baja California, through the Tijuana crossing, occasional loads that took me down the peninsula as far as La Paz before I'd turn around and head back north. Those particular runs stood out even at the time, genuinely different from the endless interstate monotony that made up most of my career. narrow mountain roads through the Sierra de la Laguna, small towns I'd only ever see from a truck cab window at 15 miles an hour navigating a switchback, a version of Mexico that felt worlds away from the produce warehouses and way stations that otherwise defined my working life. I remembered, from those trips, catching glimpses of small towns along Highway 19, between La Paz and Cabo, one in particular, Todos Santos, where I'd stopped once for gas and coffee, and stood for maybe 10 minutes watching the Pacific from a bluff near the edge of town, genuinely struck, in the middle of an exhausting cross-border haul, by how still that particular light looked over the water. I mentioned that memory to Susan more than once over the following decades, telling the story at dinner parties and family gatherings, until it had become something close to a fixed piece of our shared history. The truck stop that got away, and when we finally started seriously researching retirement destinations. She was the one who actually looked up whether that same town still existed the way I remembered it. We flew down for a scouting trip about 8 months after I sold the truck, and Todos Santos turned out to be everything that decades-old glimpse had promised. A small pueblo Mexico of maybe 7,000 people tucked between the Sierra de la Laguna mountains and the Pacific, an old fishing and farming town that had slowly become a haven for surfers, artists, and retirees, without ever fully losing its working roots. We spent 6 days walking the town methodically, Susan with a notepad the way she used to chart patient rounds, noting which streets stayed cool through the afternoon heat, which small clinics and pharmacies sat within a reasonable walk, whether the nearest hospital in La Paz, roughly an hour north, felt close enough for genuine peace of mind given my own recent health scare. We found a small rental house with a covered porch facing west, close enough to the Malican that we could walk down most evenings, and signed a lease within the week, both of us more certain about this particular decision than either of us had expected to feel. The landlord, an older Mexican woman named Doa Isela, who'd built the house herself with her late husband decades earlier, walked us through the property with obvious pride, gesturing at the porch in particular, and telling us, through a mix of English and patient repetition, that it had been built specifically to catch the sunset, a detail that felt, given everything that Porch would eventually teach me, almost too fitting to be coincidental. I want to comment down below and ask, honestly, if any of you have retired from a career built around constant motion, trucking, nursing shift work, anything with that same relentless rhythm, and whether you found the actual stillness of retirement harder to adjust to than you expected going in. Moving in didn't fix the restlessness, and I think that surprised both Susan and me more than it should have. That first porch evening, 6 minutes and then up, wasn't an isolated incident. For the better part of 2 months, I found myself pacing our small living room most evenings, taking pointless drives around town in the rental car just to feel motion again. Once literally circling the same 4 blocks near the plaza for nearly an hour, because sitting at home felt physically unbearable in a way I genuinely couldn't articulate to Susan, who'd start most of those evenings watching me with the specific worried expression she used to reserve for exhausted new parents on her hospital floor. I took up strange, pointless projects just to stay busy, reorganizing our small kitchen cabinets 3 separate times in a single week, offering to help a neighbor move furniture he hadn't actually asked for help moving. Anything that let my body keep doing what 30 years had trained it to consider normal. One particularly bad evening, about 6 weeks in, I actually got in the rental car at 9 at night and drove the hour up to La Paz and back for no reason beyond the specific desperate relief of highway motion, arriving home well past midnight to find Susan still awake, waiting up, not angry exactly, just quietly worried in a way that finally cut through my own denial about what was actually happening to me. She finally sat me down one night, in the direct way 34 years of nursing had trained into her, and told me she thought I was grieving something I hadn't actually named yet, not the truck itself, but the specific identity of always being in motion, always heading somewhere, and that sitting still felt to me like a kind of disappearing. She reminded me, gently, of something she'd noticed decades earlier, and never quite said out loud, that I'd always been a genuinely restless sleeper, even at home between routes, and that maybe 30 years of professional motion hadn't created the restlessness so much as given it somewhere useful to go. The turning point came from a man named Ram, a local panga fisherman I'd struck up a habit of watching from the beach most mornings during one of my restless pre-dawn walks, unable to sleep, drawn to the water the same way I used to be drawn to an open highway before sunrise. He'd been fishing that same stretch of coast for over 20 years, inheriting the boat and the trade from his own father, and I'd watch him and his teenage nephew load gear, and push off before the sun fully cleared the Sierra de la Laguna behind town. A routine that had the exact same practiced, unhurried competence I used to feel doing my own pre-trip inspection at 4 in the morning at a truck stop outside Amarillo. He noticed me watching him prep his boat for probably 2 weeks straight before he finally waved me over one morning and, in careful English mixed with patient gestures, asked if I wanted to come out. I said yes before I'd fully thought about it. The same impulsive yes I used to give dispatchers offering an extra load. A reflex apparently 30 years deep enough that even retirement hadn't fully removed it. That first morning on Rams Panga, chasing Dorado a few miles offshore, I noticed something I hadn't felt in months. A specific, focused stillness. Hands busy with the line, eyes fixed on the water, entirely present in a way my restless porch evenings had never once managed to produce. I got seasick almost immediately. Something Ram found genuinely hilarious given how many hours I'd spent behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler without a single moment of motion sickness in 30 years. And he handed me a piece of ginger candy from a stash he apparently kept specifically for exactly this situation with new passengers, laughing the whole time in a way that somehow made the humiliation easier to sit with than it should have been. Ram took me out most weeks after that. And somewhere around my 6th or 7th trip, he said something, through halting English and my own halting attempts at Spanish, that actually reframed the whole problem for me. He told me fishing wasn't about sitting still at all. It was about a different kind of motion. Slower, quieter, but motion nonetheless. The boat rocking, the line moving, the whole ocean itself never actually stopping even when it looked calm from shore. He said the porch had felt impossible to me, because I'd been trying to force stillness onto a body that had spent 30 years learning motion, when what I actually needed was simply a slower motion to ease into instead of an abrupt stop I was demanding of myself all at once. He compared it, in a phrase I've thought about often since, to a truck downshifting on a long grade rather than slamming the brakes, a comparison that landed with a specific force, given who was hearing it, a lifetime trucker being taught, by a fisherman half his working experience but somehow twice his patience, that the actual skill he'd never learned was deceleration rather than motion itself. I started applying that same idea beyond just fishing. Instead of forcing myself to sit motionless on the porch each evening, I started walking the Malikan first, a slow, deliberate 30-minute loop timed to end right as the lights started really turning, arriving at my own porch already partway settled rather than expecting stillness to arrive instantly the moment I sat down. Susan started walking with me most evenings, the two of us finally getting the kind of unhurried, uninterrupted conversation time that 40 years of opposite shifts and long-haul routes had rarely allowed us. Catching up on decades of small things that had always gotten compressed into brief phone calls between a dispatch and a delivery. Whole stories about her hospital colleagues or my old dispatcher I was only now hearing in full for the first time. Details that had always existed, but had never once had the specific luxury of an unhurried 30 minutes to actually be told properly. About 4 months in, I finally made it through an entire sunset on that porch, without standing up once. I remember the specific evening clearly, the sky doing the full range of color Todos Santos is apparently famous for, orange bleeding into a deep pink and then a settling blue, Susan's hand resting on my knee the way it used to on the rare long drives we'd taken together early in our marriage, before the separate schedules really took hold. I didn't feel restless. I didn't feel the specific itch to move that had defined nearly every evening for the previous 4 months. I just sat there, genuinely still, for the first extended stretch of stillness I think I'd experienced in 3 decades, and when Susan finally spoke, quietly, just to ask if I was doing all right, I realized I'd been sitting long enough that she genuinely started to wonder, which struck us both once I pointed it out as the funniest possible way that particular milestone could have announced itself. Ram still takes me out most weeks, and I've gotten competent enough now that he occasionally lets me run the boat myself while he handles the lines, a small trust I don't think either of us takes for granted given how it started. Susan's joined us a handful of times too, though she mostly prefers the porch, and I've come to understand that between the two of us, we've built something neither the truck nor her hospital floor ever fully allowed: actual shared time, unhurried, present, not compressed into the gaps between two demanding, relentless careers. Michelle and Kevin both visited within the same month last spring. the first time either of them had seen the house, and I took each of them out on Ram's Panga separately, watching Kevin in particular relax into the boat's rhythm, with the specific ease of someone who'd grown up around engines and motion even if trucking hadn't ultimately been his path. Michelle, less naturally at ease on the water, still sat quietly on the porch with me and Susan our final evening together, watching the sunset without needing to fill the silence with conversation. And near the end of it she said, quietly, that this was the stillest she'd ever actually seen me. A comment that landed harder than she probably intended given the truck engine story she'd told at her own wedding years earlier. I told her she was right, and that it had taken me the better part of a year, a heart scare, and a patient Mexican fisherman to get there. I think about that first 6-minute failure often, sitting out there most evenings now with Susan, the sky doing its nightly performance over the Pacific. 30 years on the road taught me plenty about endurance, about pushing through exhaustion, about the specific discipline of covering distance no matter how tired you were. It never once taught me how to simply arrive somewhere and stay, and I don't think I fully understood until Ram handed me that first fishing line, that arriving and staying required its own kind of practice entirely. One I'd never had any reason to develop across 3 decades of always heading somewhere else. Susan asked me last week, watching the sun drop below the horizon, in that specific final few seconds Toto Santos does so well, whether I missed the road at all. I told her the honest truth, that I still dream about specific stretches of I-40 more often than I'd have expected. The particular quality of light through a windshield at 5 in the morning somewhere in New Mexico, a kind of motion I don't think ever fully leaves a man who spent 30 years inside it. But I told her I didn't miss it enough to trade this porch for it. Not anymore. Not after learning, at 68, with a fisherman's patient help. That stillness was never actually the opposite of the freedom I'd spent 30 years chasing down every highway in this country. It just turned out to be a different, quieter version of the exact same thing. One that took a heart scare, a patient wife, and a Mexican fisherman half my age to actually teach me how to receive. I still keep my old CDL in a drawer somewhere, expired now, more sentimental object than functional document. And every so often I take it out and look at the photo. A younger, heavier man squinting into a DMV camera 30 years ago. Someone who couldn't have imagined, back then, that the hardest skill he'd ever learn wouldn't be backing a trailer into a tight loading dock or navigating a mountain. Pass in bad weather, but simply learning, decades later, how to sit on a porch beside his wife and let an entire sunset happen without needing to be anywhere else. I'm Gary Collins. Thank you for listening to Retired in Mexico.